truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, June 14th, 2024, the 1,241st day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. When you become a paid subscriber, you get the ad-free experience. You can participate in the conversation over on Substack. And you are invited to participate in the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack or a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so we are going to keep things domestic once again because yesterday President Trump was back in Washington, D.C. to meet with Republicans on Capitol Hill for the first time since January 6th, 2021, the day of the very violent insurrection. All of the stories about Trump's meeting contain that fact because, of course, they have to let everybody know that Donald Trump, the president, is an insurrectionist. It's not all of those men and women there in their best business suits pretending to represent the American people, but actually working on behalf of a long-term foreign occupation. No, Donald Trump is the insurrectionist. And there have been some headlines coming out of Trump's meeting. He made some comments, and the media is trying to make hay off a portion of his talk dealing with election integrity and crime in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The reported comments are that Trump said Milwaukee is a horrible city. We are being told this is offensive, it's quite possibly racist, and it is sure to cause Trump to lose the very real election this year in Wisconsin, just like he really lost it in 2020. Were there hundreds of thousands of illegal, unlawful, unconstitutional votes in that election? Yes, and even the courts agree, but totally, Trump lost in 2020. And he's going to lose again this year because he said Milwaukee is a horrible city. Now, he didn't say that, but even if he had, that's fine. People in California know San Francisco went to shit. I lived in Los Angeles for almost 20 years. I loved Los Angeles. Los Angeles went to shit. It's a horrible city now. They are changing it into what they call a global city and a smart city. That's awful. It's overrun with illegal aliens and homeless people doing drugs in the middle of the day. The taxes are out of control. The government is out of control. The communism and the culture it produces is right up in your face all the time, encroaching on virtually everything you do. And of course, all of that stems from election fraud. No one can be held accountable because they know that the elections aren't real. You get in, you serve your masters, not the people, and you stay in. The elections are the opportunity for the people to pretend they did it. It would be like having your dad take you in his arms and fly you around the room saying, I'm flying, I'm flying. No. Just someone who understands that you can't tell the difference is telling you you're flying. This is why it actually matters that it's not just the presidency that's stolen in our elections. These cities are going to shit because bought off, corrupted, compromised, uniparty politicians illegitimately seated in office are implementing the same agenda all around the country. That agenda produces horrible cities, and it's kind of designed to produce horrible cities. The cities, you see, are meant to be like third world countries. You have the ultra-rich, and then you have an impoverished servant class. The fact that Milwaukee is a horrible city for election fraud, and it is, we just discussed Claire Woodall-Vaugh a few weeks ago, who's been fired as the executive director of the Milwaukee Election Commission. It's because she and her former deputy were involved in the election fraud of 2020 and in the election fraud of other races, of course. Milwaukee has long had some of the worst elections in the country, and of course that bleeds into every other aspect of life because the people have no ability to hold public officials accountable. So Donald Trump did not say that Milwaukee was a horrible city, but if he had, he would still be right. And I'm not trying to insult you, Wisconsinites, Wisconsinians, Wisconsiners, I don't know. You got a lovely state. It's beautiful during the summertime. And you've got some lovely people as well. You also have some really deranged communists up there. We can't lie about that. But I'm sure no one knows better than Wisconsinians about how horrible a city Milwaukee has come. In the same way, I can tell you better than just about anyone how bad Los Angeles has become. The agenda is not to make these cities nice for everyone. The same way the COVID masks weren't really to keep you safe during the very deadly pandemic. But of course, we know what's at work here. When elections are not free and fair, safe and secure, when the results do not reflect the will and intent of the voter, then elections are only a battle of narratives. And if the elections are legit, the results of the election then become proof over who won the battle of narratives. It is always a battle of narratives. In order to steal the elections on behalf of Joe Biden in Wisconsin, you would need people to believe there's some way Joe Biden could have possibly won Wisconsin, which means there needs to be a whole lot of narrative work done to convince people that Wisconsinites would turn on Donald Trump. And that's what this is for. This is for messaging to standard issue villagers on the uniparty left and the uniparty right that Donald Trump said something dumb and he turned off all of Wisconsin. All of the Wisconsiners heard Donald Trump say mean things about Milwaukee and they were like, oh, that Donald Trump, that's the last straw. I'm going to go with the old racist pervert who can't form sentences and keeps wandering off. And hey, if you want to feel positive about something, think about how much the political environment, the conversation in this country has changed over the last 8 years. Comments like this in 2016 would have been some kind of controversy for Donald Trump. Now, not only do people not care, this actually works out for Donald Trump. He didn't say the comments in the first place, so it hurts the media. Even if he said the thing, it would be right, and anyone smart who got upset at it at all would immediately get over it. And the fact that they're making it go viral means that people begin having conversations. Did you hear what Trump said? He said Milwaukee was a horrible city. He's going to lose Wisconsin now. Anyone who says that, the response is going to be, what? It is a horrible city. Who cares about that? And then if they dig into the story at all, they're going to find out he was talking about election integrity and crime. And maybe at some point, the standard issue villagers out there might begin connecting the two. Oh, you mean the people aren't actually voting to have their cities destroyed and their country invaded and their taxes raised? The people aren't voting for fake foreign proxy wars? And I agree that it's a shame it's taken them this long to have these sorts of thoughts and these sorts of conversations, but they're starting. And once that switch is flipped in people's heads, it all starts sounding this way. So the mainstream media runs all these headlines. The story is entirely dependent on a misquoting of Donald Trump, according to numerous people in the room who put their names on record. The claim about the comments is also according to someone in the room, but that person won't go on the record. Now, again, I don't care if he said it or not, and I doubt that any serious Wisconsin-er cares either, but some uniparty right member must have thought they would, must have wanted to try to give something to the uniparty that might help them battle against Donald Trump. But as far as anonymously sourced comments from the meeting go, I feel like this one's much better. This is from CNBC yesterday. Trump floats eliminating U.S. income tax and replacing it with tariffs on imports. Wow. Trump would end the federal income tax? It's quite a bold campaign promise, is it not? Donald Trump on Thursday brought up the idea of imposing, quote, all tariff policy, end quote. That would ultimately enable the U.S. to get rid of the income tax. Sources in a private meeting with the Republican presidential candidate told CNBC. Trump, in the meeting with GOP lawmakers at the Capitol Hill Club in Washington, D.C., also talked about using tariffs to leverage negotiating power over bad actors, according to another source in the room. And how great would that be if the country could simply be protected with tariffs? Oh, I know. Our ability to have things made in China through, quote unquote, free trade. That's so much more important. The remarks show Trump, who championed tariffs as a foreign policy multi-tool during his first term in office, is considering a drastically more protectionist trade agenda if he defeats President Joe Biden in November. Ah, yes, focus on that part and not the cancellation of the federal income tax. Spokespeople for Trump's campaign did not immediately respond to CNBC's requests for comment. Trump, in a Truth Social post later Thursday morning, said there was lots discussed, all positive, in the meeting without providing any more details. Trump's remark about replacing income taxes with tariffs quickly drew critics. Broadly substituting tariffs for income tax is a sure way to hit hard, low, and middle-income Americans and reward top. New York University School of Law professor David Kamen wrote on X, "Thank goodness we have elite university professors, liberal ones, obviously, to remind us that actually the global regime's agenda is the only moral choice for low and middle income people." Washington Post op-ed columnist Catherine Rampell noted that since tens of millions of Americans who pay no federal income taxes would presumably fall under Trump's tariff plan, quote, "This sounds like a huge tax increase on the lower and middle income classes." Now, the only way to get to this point is by being a degenerate communist. And of course, these policies were argued for initially on this same basis. But the idea here is that free trade has allowed Americans to buy really cheap consumer goods that, we all just need so badly. All the stuff that we order addictively and obsessively off Amazon, so it always feels like something is arriving at the house and our lives are always getting better. We need all that stuff, and we need it at the lowest possible prices. And we get those prices because we have free trade. And in China, they just use slave labor. And the neocons and the globalists, they've moved so much of our manufacturing over to China and over to Southeast Asia over the past 4 decades that, well, that's just the system now. And most certainly, the American people must agree that they are happy to continue paying the federal income tax rather than funding the government through tariffs so that they can keep getting cheap stuff. Donald Trump is attacking poor people. That's why he proposed the policy. He knows it's going to be bad for them, but he hates them. Sure, he'll tell them he cares about them, and he will create other policies that help them a great deal. And he'll also produce a booming economy so that there's more economic activity in general, but he hates them. And because minorities, the black and brown people, they're the poorest, therefore, Donald Trump is a racist. And you remember, child brains, when he said there are very fine people on both sides. Well, I know that's been debunked based on his actual words, but this too is racist, which means, hey, remember when he was racist before? Yeah, I know he wasn't. You think he wasn't. But here's another example, which means that he is now and was then. And if you want him to eliminate the federal income tax, well, you're racist too. And the last bit of this article is totally unrelated to the topic, so normally I would skip a section like this. But if you think about that for just 1 second longer, I'm not the news. Why is the news including this last section that has nothing to do with the article? Here it is. Trump's swing through Capitol Hill to meet with Republican lawmakers and business leaders. That's the part that has to do with the article. Marked his first return to the area since January 6, 2021, when the then president urged his supporters to march to the U.S. Capitol to protest his 2020 loss to Biden. Trump was later impeached in the House for inciting the violent mob that stormed the Capitol and temporarily halted the peaceful transfer of presidential power. What? The article is about Trump reportedly proposing the idea in a closed-door meeting of eliminating the federal income tax and replacing it with tariffs. And they're making sure to remind us about the false narrative surrounding the very violent insurrection? So which one of these stories is more important, more relevant to people's lives? Trump's misreported comments calling Milwaukee horrible, or the yet unconfirmed rumor about Trump thinking of eliminating the federal income tax? I think the choice is pretty obvious. And I'm inclined to believe that the reporting about these comments is correct because Trump has proposed tariff-based trade policies before. He said he had a deal with Xi worked out, and then we were hit by the invisible enemy. One happened and then the other happened. And sure, the very deadly pandemic came from China. But it's not like it started all because of that trade agreement or anything. So we have that as a proof. We know that Trump is interested in tariffs. And we know that all of the global regimes, political brands in the United States oppose the tariffs. They want that income tax. They were even upset when Donald Trump instituted tariffs while leaving the totally legitimate tax in place in his first term. The progressives claim tariffs are a tax on the poor. The libertarians, they're all about free trade. They say this is a disruption to free trade. They want illegal aliens coming in to provide cheap labor, and Chinese slavery, well, that's good exploitation if you can get it. The neocons will literally go to war with anyone for disrupting the global regime's trade and economic systems. So all of the branches of the Uniparty oppose this, and Donald Trump pursues it anyway to show the country, hey, this can work. And if it can work and benefit the American people with just the tariffs alone, imagine what would happen if we stopped charging a federal income tax that continued justifying all of the ridiculous spending and $35 trillion in national debt and counting that will obviously never be repaid. And trust me, I feel really bad for the global bankers that they're not going to get that money back. But, well, oops, I guess. Usually they're able to just start wars to fix that problem, and for some reason this time they can't. Isn't that strange? But we know Trump likes tariffs. Here's CNN over the weekend. This is from the 9th. Trump proposes eliminating taxes on tips at Las Vegas campaign rally. Donald Trump proposed eliminating taxes on tips at a Sunday campaign rally in Las Vegas as he looks to win over voters in a critical swing state that has a sizable number of service industry workers. The proposal, which came at the presumptive GOP nominee's first campaign rally since his historic conviction in his New York hush money trial last month, was immediately slammed by the state's powerful culinary union as, quote, wild campaign promises from a convicted felon. Oh, the state's powerful culinary union is saying that about the president? That sounds really desperate. Do they even really represent the interests of their workers? Or is that not what unions do? Are unions actually the product of total inversion within the false reality where rather than representing the employees to the ownership class, the unions exist to convince the workers they're getting a bargain while doing whatever the ownership class wants? And forcing the workers to pay for that opportunity? Well, yeah, of course that's what it is. It sounds like the culinary union knows it's not long for this world. So Trump proposes the idea of not taxing tips. Well, why would tip income be treated as a special class of income? Is Trump just saying this to create a narrative about how he could potentially win Nevada, despite former Democrat Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid rigging the shit out of the Silver State and developing a model for the rest of the country? Well, it could be partly that we see the regime's tricks turned back around on them all the time. So it could be that, or there could be something else to it. But if conceptually, philosophically, principally, you're going to suggest that tip income not be taxed, well, then other income surely shouldn't be taxed as well. So Trump proposing the end to the federal income tax and replace it with tariffs already has two sub-arguments backing it up, pointing in that direction, suggesting this is something Trump aims to do. And let's go for a third. Trump has been talking up Bitcoin quite a bit lately. He is totally on board with Bitcoin at this point. At the Libertarian Convention, he promised that he would preserve the right to self-custody. He said he's not going to let Elizabeth Warren or any of those other people get their hands on your Bitcoin. And he promised that there would never be a central bank digital currency in the United States. Well, on Tuesday, he had a meeting with the Bitcoin mining community down in Palm Beach, Florida. This is CNBC yesterday. Bitcoin miners at Donald Trump's closed-door event say he thinks Bitcoin can help win the AI arms race. What? That's weird. Maybe someone should go and find Donald Trump and say to him, Mr. President, what if the power goes out? I'm sure that question would probably stump him because in truth, there's no answer to that question and everybody knows it. I can't believe Donald Trump has never thought of it. But here's the thing. The phrase AI arms race is basically one of the big pieces of Jason Lowery's Softwar thesis that I have talked about many times, as has G Money and Patriots in Progress over on Rug Pull Radio. My pal Burning Bright has gotten on board with Jason Lowery and Softwar, and as I've said many times, that is the thesis that convinced me that Bitcoin was so much more than the digital currency people talk about and is totally unlike all of the other alternatives. And I'm not going to spend too long on this article, but the Intimate Gathering brought together a coalition of some of the biggest private and public American miners in the business, including representatives from Riot Platforms, Marathon Digital Holdings, TerraWolf, CleanSpark, Core Scientific, Archon Energy, Choya Energy, and Exacor. CNBC spoke to half the miners who attended the closed-door session on Tuesday, including the CEO of Riot Platforms. Jason Less told CNBC that one of the group's talking points was the fact that the U.S. is number one in a lot of things, and it should be number one at Bitcoin, especially as the world's top coin touches new all-time price highs, blah, 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 and they start talking about Bitcoin's price. Irrelevant to the conversation. Totally irrelevant. That is a red herring. This article could have been written by a retarded person. Let's skip down a bit. Less than 4 hours after Trump's roundtable wrapped, the former president took to social media to extol the virtues of the Bitcoin mining business. Bitcoin mining may be our last line of defense against a CBDC, Trump posted shortly before midnight on Tuesday. What do you think he means there? Well, whose project is the central bank digital currency? Bitcoin is our last line of defense? It's probably just a euphemism. He's probably not talking about software, just a euphemism. Biden's hatred of Bitcoin only helps China, Russia, and the radical communist left. We all want the remaining Bitcoin to be made in the USA. It will help us be energy dominant. You think he just means drill, baby, drill the whole time? All he's meant is he's going to drill for more oil? No, that's not what he means. Bitcoin is pure energy. It is a defense and national security infrastructure. It is also a communications platform and a currency platform. And I understand that that is quite a lot, which is why, again, I would encourage all of you to read Softwar if you have enough familiarity with the matter or you're willing to be patient and take your time and learn some new concepts along the way. I recommend either of those. Or if you don't think you're ready for that yet, go to the info stream on Telegram, t.me/veryreasonable. Use the little magnifying glass icon and search the word Softwar. One word, Softwar, like software without the E. And just listen to a talk with Jason Lowery. Choose the shortest video, choose the longest video. Just begin familiarizing yourself with the language and the concepts. You may not understand it in one day. If you do, cheers to you, good for you. But most people won't because it's complicated. But it's also important, and it's not me telling you that. It's now Donald Trump telling you that. He's talking about it as national defense infrastructure, and he's talking about it as the last line of defense from the global regime's central bank digital currency. Bitcoin and some other cryptocurrencies are created through a process known as proof of work, in which miners around the world run high-powered computers that collectively validate transactions and simultaneously create new tokens. The process requires heaps of electricity, leading miners to seek out the cheapest sources of power. Many have begun to set up shop in the U.S. in the last few years, much to the chagrin of a mix of mostly Democratic lawmakers, including Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now consider who's been focused on keeping energy prices low versus keeping energy prices high and actually escalating energy prices, cutting off the supply of fossil fuels, replacing them with other sources of energy that cannot produce enough energy cheaply enough. Consider all the rampant bullshit of the green agenda, the climate agenda, and consider that in parallel to what you just heard about the energy consumption from Bitcoin mining. And then pair that with pro-Bitcoin people like Elon Musk and think about what is happening up there in the sky. I would also suggest, by the way, that everybody go on Rumble, search out Rug Pull Radio on Badlands Media, Rug Pull, one word, RUGPULL. Pair that with Kwast, KWAST, and watch that interview. Many of us have been trying to tell you this is where things are headed. Do we know it 100%? No, we don't have special information. We can never know anything 100%, but many different elements of the big picture, the big puzzle, all point in the same direction and connect in the same places. And now they're even connecting at the same point in time. If someone out there is trying to scam you, it's probably the people telling you to stick with the regime's currency. And I know that the people who are into precious metals think that they have an out. And hey, I get it. I'm not opposed to precious metals. Go ahead and invest in precious metals. But also understand that they can increase the supply of gold or silver whenever they want. And they already have a paper trade layered onto your gold and silver, so they manipulate the price as well. And I hope that all goes away and those prices skyrocket. But if you were to find out, for instance, that they could reproduce gold or silver and don't have to mine it from the ground, like with diamonds, then maybe that store of wealth and store of value isn't all it's cracked up to be. Now, I don't know that for sure, but if you look at the patterns of exposure and what has been exposed over this time and you think that's impossible, at some point you're basically just in the same mindset that says your car runs on dinosaur juice. This is quite a long article, and I don't mean to focus too much of the discussion on this subject. I know some people don't like this subject, and I'm sorry, but it's not like you're going to stop hearing about it. And it's not because of my choice. This is just about to become part of everyone's lives. We talk quite a bit about BRICS. Everybody is pretty sure that's going to be a gold-backed currency, although I have no idea why. People are sure of that. Yes, there are those rumors. They also have rumors about it being backed with digital currencies. There's only one of those it could be. I hear people occasionally asking questions about Bitcoin being backed by gold. Now, if you understand Bitcoin, that doesn't make sense. Also, Bitcoin is harder money than gold. If anything, it seems like the way forward would be for the dollar to be backed by Bitcoin, with potentially a basket of other cryptocurrencies or digital assets that would allow for additional functions. But just as we were talking about new energy infrastructure and national defense infrastructure and currency, we're also talking about the comms thing. It needs to be peer-to-peer. And that's part of what we seem to be in the process of. And if payments begin to be processed peer-to-peer without going through the credit card companies and the banks and the payment processors, then it's a lot more like using cash to give from one person to another, which makes it very, very difficult to tax, which is essentially the payment model for people who take tips. So would that payment model expand beyond people who take tips? The answer is obviously yes. And then it would depend what kind of business you have. What about a small business that employs a few people? You have to pay your 5 employees. And the way it is now, you have to register them all with the government, with the state. You have to pay the government so that the government can someday give them back the benefits you're paying for. And then you as a business, you as a person, and your employees all have to pay the government for some reason, or the government won't allow you to operate your business nor your employees to work there. And in order to remain in compliance with their system, you have to fill out all sorts of paperwork. Again, for no reason, destroying your productivity. So maybe it would just be better to avoid the government altogether and just pay people peer to peer. And in that situation, gosh, it would be awfully hard to collect taxes, especially without tracking each and everything you do. And of course, that's what they want to do in the central bank digital currency system. That's what they want to do in the tax system that goes along with it. And so it should be no surprise that committed supporters of the global regime and its agenda want to keep the personal federal income tax in place rather than going to tariffs. They say it's all out of concern for people in the lower and middle economic classes, but in order to remain in their system, all those people are going to have to sign up to the central bank's digital currency and comply with all the speech and lifestyle and medical choices required in order to keep your social credit score up high enough to be able to do the things in life you want to do, including be able to earn an income. And unless you want to sit inside a little box and stare at a screen for the rest of your life, you're probably going to want to participate in those other parts of life, and they will control the access to all those other parts. Or we could just say, screw all that and do the peer-to-peer thing. I mean, if everyone is prepared to ride without the training wheels, in that system, there would be no real way to tax everyone on their income. And so yet again, you have another direction and another path into understanding the likelihood that Donald Trump did actually propose that idea or mention that idea in his closed-door meeting with Republicans yesterday. Now, if you're like me, you've probably watched some documentaries, read some articles, maybe read some books. Maybe you are way beyond me and far more advanced in this subject. And so I hope that I don't mess anything up to the point where you cringe and shut the show off. But I imagine many of you have probably heard arguments about the illegitimacy of the federal income tax stemming from a few things: the illegitimacy of the 16th Amendment, misinterpretations of the 16th Amendment, and the fact that the tax system as it exists is supported only by case law and precedent and not any actual law. It's just a practice that everyone complies in voluntarily to be able to work certain places or participate in certain systems, and that is very unfortunate. And so I wanted to pull some good sources to go through to better illustrate some of these points. And now when I'm going to do that, I often go to perplexity.ai rather than a normal search engine because it offers just a different style of search. And just to be clear, I would caution anyone against using one of these AIs for research and then just trusting and believing its answer. I don't think that's a very smart way to use these things. I think you'll probably end up with a bunch of very bad beliefs if you do that. And we may get to some of that later in the show if we have time. But as far as a jumping off point for research, I think that they can be really good and really productive. And I posted about this over on Telegram and Truth Social today. I said, here are some fun searches to do on Perplexity AI. And if you are sitting around the computer this weekend and you feel like learning some new things or brushing up on some old things, go to Perplexity AI. Here are some sample questions that I was entering earlier and found quite interesting. Was the 16th Amendment properly ratified? Was the 14th Amendment properly ratified? What are the best arguments to repeal the 11th Amendment? Have arguments against standing in election fraud related lawsuits been made on the basis of the 11th Amendment? There are very interesting rabbit holes on all of this. And you will find out pretty quickly how thoroughly your Constitution has been overturned and how totally illegitimate your government is. What has been done to the Constitution of this country is an absolute abomination, and it is the product of foreign influence and corruption. So here's the question I started out with in my search for information on the 16th Amendment. Was there anything unusual about the ratification of the 16th Amendment? And the answer should always be no, right? All of the constitutional amendments that we are told we must be patriotic about and defend with our lives Surely they must have been reached in the proper ways by our forefathers. I mean, sure, absolutely none of us gave approval to any of this, but at least they must have, and now it's been passed down through the generations, and we all take part in the very, very real election process, so now we all have ownership over this. And sure, we'll always have our arguments, but at least everything that's happened was totally legal. And yes, the Constitution has absolutely been inverted, overturned, and overthrown, but they did it constitutionally. So I type in my question, was there anything unusual about the ratification of the 16th Amendment, expecting the AI to return the answer, no, of course not. Things were fine, just like they've always been fine, most especially for the 14th Amendment. But instead, the AI returns this: tax protester 16th Amendment arguments. What? Tax protester arguments? I just asked if it was properly ratified. And I searched for the same thing on a search engine and found the first entry to be a Wikipedia article that's called Tax Protester 16th Amendment Arguments. And I said, wow, or even more like Owen Wilson. Wow, I guess there's really something to this. Those pesky tax protesters must be the ones most concerned about the ratification of this amendment, because clearly no one else is. Here is what Perplexity AI returned. There were some irregularities in the ratification process of the 16th Amendment that granted Congress the power to levy an income tax. Here are the key points. The 16th Amendment states, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. However, when the amendment was sent to the states for ratification, several states made minor errors or deviations in the text they approved, such as Illinois used remuneration instead of enumeration. Missouri substituted levy for lay. Washington had income instead of incomes. Other states had capitalization, punctuation, or spelling errors. Only 4 states ratified the exact text as proposed by Congress. Despite the deviations, Secretary of State Philander C. Knox declared the amendment legally ratified in 1913 after 38 states approved it, concluding the variations were trivial, and the Supreme Court, in all its shining legitimacy throughout that period, said, hey, that's fine. But that's the answer from AI. You can't trust the machine. I would never tell you to trust the machine. Let's go to an even more authoritative source. This is from ReaganLibrary.gov. And you know how it works if you're a good Republican. The word Reagan makes you ignore the word government. Amendment 16 to the Constitution was ratified on February 3rd, 1913. It grants Congress the authority to issue an income tax without having to determine it based on population. The official text is written as such. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. In the Constitution's original writing, the taxing clause in Article 1 grants Congress the general authority to lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, and excises. And that is a direct quote. For quote-unquote direct taxes, Article 1 commands that they must be collected based on the population of the states. Before an income tax was established, the majority of funds given to the federal government derived from tariffs on domestic and international goods. So the 16th Amendment overturned what the original Constitution said about the federal government's ability to tax, and at that point, tariffs were replaced by federal income taxes. The short-lived Revenue Act of 1861, Civil War era, predated the 16th Amendment as the first official federal income tax, but it was eventually repealed in 1872. The end of the 19th century saw the beginning of the Progressive Era. Oh, did that come right after the period where they overturned the Constitution, which you can read all about, by the way, in a committed Zionist, leftist, die-hard academic, George P. Fletcher, Columbia Law School professor, in his book, Our Secret Constitution, that describes how the point of the Civil War, according to Abraham Lincoln, and this is what makes him a hero, was to overthrow the Constitution, to replace a republic with a democracy, to replace personal liberty with equality among all people, and to replace individualism with a preference for the nation. Fletcher then goes into a conversation about how after the 14th Amendment was passed, the Supreme Court had to be adjusted until it began making its decisions and reaching its opinions through the lens of the 14th Amendment, which is why you should go research the ratification of the 14th Amendment, but we won't get off into that. So they had already overthrown the Constitution. They had already set up the courts to enforce the new Constitution and make that legal precedent. Then they went ahead and, quote unquote, ratified the 16th Amendment. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we just entered the Progressive Era. The end of the 19th century saw the beginning of the Progressive Era, a time period in which political and social reform centered on industry, voting, immigration, and several other topical issues of the time period. Levying a federal income tax became a key goal for many progressive groups. The key argument being it was fairer for wealthy individuals to pay for the taxes and tariffs that had been largely obliged from the middle class and the poor in society. Congress passed the 1894 Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which contained an income tax provision of 2% on incomes over $4,000, equivalent to about $135,951 in 2022 U.S. dollars. Supporters of this new income tax argued that it was not specifically a quote-unquote direct tax, which would require it to be apportioned among the states. Two previous Supreme Court decisions supported this thesis, but the 5-4 decision in 1895's Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company ruled that the income tax in the act was a direct tax. The core argument that the income tax in the act was sourced from deriving income from an individual's property. Based on this, the court asserted that direct taxes included any sort of income tax on rents, dividends, and interest, therefore making them legally required to be apportioned among the states. 14 years after the Pollock decision, President William H. Taft proposed to Congress a new income tax of 2% on corporations. This would be imposed by an excise tax on manufactured goods and an amendment to the Constitution to legally sanction the most recent federal income tax. Several conservative senators proposed different versions of the new amendment throughout 1909. Many citizens living in the West and the South supported an income tax on the grounds that it would be an easier way to raise funds on those less well off. Several key Republicans, including former President Theodore Roosevelt, who started the Progressive Party, began to believe that the new amendment's income tax would be good to help finance the United States' increasing political and military power. These insurgent Republicans, many of whom would go on to create the Bull Moose Party, stood in opposition to the establishment Republicans in Congress. Their opposition to the new amendment was largely rooted in their connections to major businesses of the time period, while others argued that an income tax would make the federal government more powerful and centralized. Oh, yeah, that's what the Civil War did, too, and everything that followed it. And that's what's continued happening all the way up till the day we find ourselves in now. But don't worry, the federal government is only bigger and more centralized in order to look out for the poor and the middle class. They do it all for the most vulnerable every time. These people, they just can't stop giving other people stuff. The rise of the Progressive Party And the victory of the Democratic Party in the 1912 presidential election allowed for an easier ratification phase of the new amendment. From 1909 to 1913, the new amendment was ratified by the required 36 states out of the then 48. On February 3rd, 1913, just 1 month before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson, the 16th Amendment was formally accepted into the Constitution. How about that? So he'd already been elected, but hadn't yet been inaugurated. And during that period that they often call the lame duck period, that's when all this got wrapped up. And by the way, I understand that ratification is a state process. But man, if that's not interesting timing. With the income tax provision outlined in the new amendment, the Revenue Act of 1913 was soon after enacted into law by Congress. And there you go. Woodrow Wilson would have signed right off on that. The most significant long-term impact of the 16th Amendment was the shift in the way the federal government received funding for its works. What was originally conceived as a system that largely depended on tariffs at a level just slightly above the many states transformed into a more powerful, centralized institution that sourced vast quantities of funding through the many incomes of individuals and the states. Now, if you want to research some other topics this weekend as well, looking into the 1912 election would be worth your time, although I think we may have talked about that a few weeks ago in the episode about third parties. Wilson was under constant influence and pressure of one Louis Brandeis, who went on to be a Supreme Court justice, also a key figure in pushing Woodrow Wilson into coming on board with the Balfour Declaration, which eventually started the State of Israel and committed the U.S. military to fighting in not only World War I, but World War II as well. It's just remarkable how all our history makes complete and total sense as soon as you remove the inversions of the central narrative. And it's not hard to do that. All you need to do is research contemporary counter-arguments to that thing that seems like it's real off. And I'm not just saying accept any counter-argument. When you find a counter-argument, you're like, whoa, that's what happened? Look into that too. But if you see our history over this time, since at least the Civil War, and probably the entire time, sorry to say, and probably well before that, it has been a push and pull between the American good twin and evil twin and the global good twin and evil twin. It is always the same push and pull. And the evil twin in America has been chipping away now for centuries. This is how we have gotten here. Now, I have suggested many times that I think the point of what's happening right now is to reverse the brainwashing that we've all endured over decades in American life and unwind these stories so that we understand all the compromise, all the corruption, all the manipulation that has brought us to this point so that we can go ahead and unwind them. And I have said on numerous occasions, I think that what absolutely must happen as a bare minimum in my mind is that we must go all the way back to the original Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I could totally be open to going further, by the way, but I think that that is a bare minimum for now, and then working back from there. And that means that all of these improperly ratified amendments are gone. These amendments that have served to do nothing more than overthrow the Constitution, they have to be done away with. And people might argue that this would require a constitutional convention. If that's the case, so be it, but it shouldn't, because the cheating and the fraud and manipulation should be recognized and reversed, and the consequences are the consequences, come what may. If that means that a century and a half or more of court precedent and case law is reversed and removed, so be it. That's probably one of the best things that could happen to the country at this point. I don't see how you even create an illusion of legitimacy in this nation without that. And I think the process toward that might be exactly what we see. So, of course, that's going to eventually bring up the conversation about the legitimacy of the federal income tax to begin with. Trump could eliminate it, or it could already be eliminated. We've talked about the Fed coming back under the Treasury. The IRS is nothing more than the collection arm for the Fed. These are not revered American institutions. These are weapons wielded by the global regime against the American people. These institutions should not exist, and they don't have to exist. There's not some requirement for these institutions. If there's some way to repurpose them and keep the good people, quote unquote, at these institutions, then great. I'm open to possibilities. But what Trump is proposing is a necessity of his agenda in principle. We have to reach that point. There's not some option. It's got to happen. And so, if Trump was properly cited, properly quoted, if it's true that he made these comments about removing the federal income tax and funding government through tariffs, then good luck to uniparty candidates across the board. Not that the elections are real, but if we're going to play this game for the next 5 months, and it seems like we are, then we have to think in those terms. And I've said many, many times, of course, that if the elections aren't real, then it's a battle of narratives. If they are real, it's still a battle of narratives. Let's have the battle of narratives when it comes to the federal personal income tax. Let's see how that goes. Let's see Democrats and the cuckolds on the uniparty right argue that the federal personal income tax is a good thing and that sure, it should come down, but not to zero, never to zero. Let's see Joe Biden answer that in the debates. Let's see Democrats say, nah, we're not going to eliminate your taxes. In fact, we're going to raise them. And then listen to them tell us how Democrats won around the country. Sure, Donald Trump won, but the country, they wanted divided government. They wanted a more moderate approach to everything. So they reelected the people that want to keep taxes. Think about how this makes even the quote unquote staunch fiscal conservatives look. Have you heard any candidate throughout your lifetime? Maybe Ron Paul has said this. But aside from Ron Paul and Ross Perot, sort of, I'm not aware of a candidate for president in the last 40 years who has proposed abolishing the income tax. Ronald Reagan didn't do it, but Donald Trump is doing it, it seems. He's going to get it done, it seems. Or maybe it's necessarily going to happen because it can't be stopped. And maybe it's already happened. This won't be read my lips, no new taxes. This will be read my lips, no taxes. Also, whenever you read my lips, it just looks like
China, 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 China.
I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under a quarter per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/I'm your moderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's happening!